Perhaps you've noticed when you run Windows there are generally icons in the notification area. For example, Messenger or SQL Server both put icons in that lower right-hand corner of your screen. The Notify Icon control provides much of that functionality. You'll still need to write a little bit of code. This is a simple control. It doesn't have many members. But we'll look at an example that shows how you can use the Notify Icon control to display an icon and perhaps a little balloon in that lower right-hand corner of your screen. I've run the sample project, Complex Controls, and I've pressed F5 to run the project. Here now, I'm going to close the switchboard form and watch what happens in the notification area. You see down here a little icon. When I hover over it, it says Complex Controls Demo. When I right-click, we see a menu display, and I can either display the form again, or if I right-click and choose Exit, the application shuts down. Well, how is that working? Well, certainly that is a Notify Icon control doing its job. Let's look at the switchboard form to see how it's doing it. On the form, I've placed a Notify icon and a context menu strip. The context menu strip includes, as you can tell, the context menu that appears when I right-click on the Notify icon. Let's look at the properties of the Notify icon. There's a text property that controls what you see when you hover over the Notify icon. There is an icon property that indicates what icon you see. There's also a context menu strip property, which controls which context menu strip you want this control to use when you right-click on it. There's balloon tip information if you decide to display a balloon tip when you minimize the form and first display the Notify icon. You need to set the context menu strip property to ensure that you actually see the context menu when you right-click on the icon. If we look at the code for this form, you'll see there isn't too much code in here. The important part is in the form closing event handler. Let's find that first. Here it is. In the form closing event handler, we check the value of a class level variable named OK to close. That's defined way up here, and it's false by default. It's not OK to close. If it's not OK to close, we cancel the closing and just hide this form. Once the form is hidden, we've changed the visible state. So in the visible changed event handler, here it is. In the visible changed event handler for the form, we want to set the Notify icon's visible property to be the opposite of the form's visible property. So if the form's visible, the icon's invisible. If the form is invisible, the icon's visible, and that's when we see the icon in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. Now, if the checkbox had been checked on my form, and if the form wasn't visible, we would call Show Balloon Tip to display the balloon tip. And you can pass whatever information you like. Here, normally, I would just pass the length of time that I would like that balloon tip to display. In addition, we have to deal with the various menu items. So if I go out to my form again, look at the context menu strip. For example, if the user clicks Exit, what do? We call the shutdown procedure, which sets the OK to close variable to true and calls this.close. That will trigger the form closing event handler again, and in the form closing event handler, we check to see if it's OK to close. In this case, it is OK to close. None of this code runs, and the form just closes. If we go to the form again and look at the display form item, this just sets the form's visible property to true. When the form's visible property becomes true, the visible changed event handler runs, and in that case, we set the demo Notify icon's visible property to be false because now the form is visible. And that's all the code there is for this. You need to write a little bit of code to make the Notify icon control do its job. But anytime you need to minimize a form to the notification area, the Notify icon will be the tool that will make that possible. Do you need to display a web page within a form? If so, you can use the web browser control. This is a managed wrapper that uses COM interop to communicate with Internet Explorer. The web browser control has a huge number of members, and it provides very rich functionality that makes it possible for you to create, well, your own web browser that feels much like any other web browser application. If you need to embed a web browser in a form, however, you'll need to take advantage of the many events of the web browser control. We'll look at some of those in our sample application. I'll click the web browser button, which brings up our web browser sample form. You'll notice we have a web browser control here, and that's just this big white space. I have at the bottom a status strip, and over here there's a progress bar you can't see yet. It's invisible until we start navigating. Notice these buttons are disabled right now. If I enter a URL and hit enter, the Go button activates. Watch the status bar. Oops, gone already. The status bar and the progress bar gave us information. The title bar up here updates to match the page we're on. If I go to another page, watch carefully this time. You saw the status at the bottom and the progress bar. The title updates to match the page we end up on. If I go back to live.com, I can now use the back and forward buttons appropriately. This button stops the current navigation. This one refreshes the current page. This one goes to our home page, which is the blank page. This one takes us to our registered search page, which is live.com. On the File menu, we don't have much. We have the option to save the page as something. This brings up the Save dialog box. We can go to Page Setup, which brings up the web browser's Page Setup dialog box. We have the Print menu item, which allows us to print the page. We have Print Preview, which brings up the Print Preview control. We have Properties, which brings up the properties of the page. And finally, we have Exit. So there are a number of items on the File menu we can use as well. Notice that as we navigate, this bar here automatically updates to match where we've gone. Let me try this again. I'll go to live.com. Now I'll click Live Search, and this bar updates to tell me where we ended up, like a normal web browser does. Also down here, if you saw it, there was status indicating progress based on our navigation. Well, there's a lot going on. We'll need to investigate the code to see how this application actually works. If we open the form in Design View, we'll see that it consists of the web browser control here inside a toolstrip container. It's in the panel area of the toolstrip container. Plus we have a number of toolstrips. Here we have a toolstrip label. Here's a progress bar. Up here we have a text box and a toolstrip and a button. And the button here, of course, navigates to a new page. Well, let's see what the Go button does. It calls the navigate method of the browser, and actually it's calling our local navigate method. If I go to that definition, the navigate method checks to make sure that the string isn't null or empty, and if it isn't null or empty, and if it doesn't equal about :blank, then it calls the navigate method of the web browser control given an address. And of course, this could fail for some reason. If it does, we'll just fail silently. You might want to do something else. Our example just fails silently. Now you might wonder, how is it that we start navigating when we press Enter? If we look at the address text box key down event handler, in the key down event handler, we check to see if the key code that was just pressed was Enter, and if so, we begin the navigation. Now, a number of the buttons on the toolbar just call a single method. If we go back and look, you'll see that this button, for example, just calls the web browser's go back method. This one calls the web browser.go forward. This one calls the stop method. This one calls the refresh method. It only does it if the URL of the web browser doesn't equal about :blank. There's no point refreshing if we're on a blank page. This calls the go home method. This calls the go search method. So we've used a number of built-in simple methods of the web browser control to allow the web browser to behave like any normal web browser does. The form also allows you to display some dialog boxes. You saw that on the File menu. Clicking Save As brings up the Show Save As dialog. The web browser takes care of that for you. Page Setup calls the Show Page Setup dialog method. The Print menu item calls the Show Print You're getting the point here. Each one of those menu items corresponds to a single method call of the web browser control. The tricky part is dealing with environment changes as you navigate in the browser. There's status text at the bottom of the browser, down here, that shows up here. The progress bar updates. The title bar of the form updates to reflect the current page. The address text box updates to reflect the current page. And the back and forward buttons update their availability depending on the current browsing stack. To update the status text, there is a status text changed event. So if we look at the code and go find status text changed event, in the status text changed event of the browser, we just set the text of our label to be the status text of the browser. To update the progress bar, we need to display it, update it, and hide it once we're done. So in the navigating event of the browser control, at that point, we set the progress bar's visible property to be true. In the progress changed event, here, we attempt to update the progress bar's value. Now, you're passed into this event information about the current progress, and the maximum progress might be 0 or less than 0. In that case, we don't want to do anything, but if it's greater than 0, we'll set the value of the progress bar to be the current progress divided by the maximum progress times 100. You definitely don't want to be dividing by 0 here. That's why we make sure we get a good value before we start. Once we're done, we need to hide the progress bar. And this happens in the Document Completed event. Once we've downloaded the entire document, we set the visible property of the progress bar to be false. To update the title bar, there is a Document Title Changed event. And in that event handler, we set the form's text property to be the document title that the web browser supplies. How about updating the address text box? That happens in the Navigated event. In the Navigated event, we finish navigating. We may not have gotten all the document downloaded yet, but we finish navigating, and we set the text of the address text box to be E, which is handed to us, has a URL property, and we convert that to a string to place it into the text box. How do we enable and disable the buttons? Well, there's a Can Go Back changed and Can Go Forward changed events, which enable and disable those buttons. If we look for those events, we have Can Go Back changed. And you see at that point, when the Can Go Back change status changes, we set the enabled value of the back button to be whether or not we can go back. And the same for the forward button. Certainly, as you've seen, the web browser control provides a huge number of events that we can use. I've only caught a few of them here. There's a lot more that we didn't trap in order to create a rich user interface for hosting a web browser on your own forms.